urban communities, more fluid and flexible types of organizations, futurologist has called them adhocracies, emerge. Communication increasingly on the internet and in other venues, and in the whole way in which the world of television is being rapidly transformed is interactive rather than traditional mass communication of the middle of the 20th century. And the term fluidity, and this is a broad generalization, but I think valid anyway, is that both geographic and occupational movement in and out, back and forth, becomes more and more common. Well, obviously it follows from that that in this context, white-collar crime is increasingly global. Now, I understand that what I've just presented is very schematic, and always such a scheme has a certain artificiality to it, but I think nevertheless it's that taken into account somewhat valid. There are two terms from the literature of postmodern thought from Jean Baudrillard that I do think are useful to understanding white-collar crime in this new postmodern context. One is his term hyperreality, that reality has collapsed, it's replaced by image, illusion, or simulation, and the model is more real than, quote, reality. And the other term is intertextuality, that there's a complex and infinite set of interwoven relationships. Everything is related to everything else. And in terms of applying that briefly to the celebrated case of Enron, I think that you could say that hyperreality was in many ways at the center of this. This corporation was very different from General Motors and the Ford Motor Company. It had very few hard assets. What it really was dealing with were virtual assets. Markets became products. The stress was on deal-making, internet transactions, off-the-book partnerships, creative accounting, options and derivatives. None of this. This is all occurring in the world of simulation. It was all an imaginary world, really, that was created on computers. It was very, very different from the way in which traditional modern corporations, industrial corporations, have operated. So what I'm suggesting is that Enron is usefully seen not as a modern corporation, but as a post-modern corporation. I think intertextuality applies to the case of Enron as well. The intensified ties that were involved in this case. Now, again, much of this isn't entirely new, but what is very striking in this case is the involvement of corporation, of investment banking houses, of stock analysts, of auditors, of lawyers, of rating agencies, federal regulatory agencies, political leadership. The intertwining of these elements is very striking. And our policing entities are simply not well structured to focus on these webs and complex relationships. So that's another challenge. Now, in addition to living in a post-modern and globalized world, I'll say briefly that there are those who argue we're also living in a post-9/11 world. Whether it's too soon to say whether this is hype or substance, but I'll just very briefly say that it remains to be seen whether 9/11 will be seen as a national trauma or a watershed event and a defining moment in history, whether the changes since 9/11 will be transitory or enduring. Certainly, the attack on the Pentagon, the World Trade Towers, is wholly different from what we mean about white-collar crime, but I want to briefly suggest that there are some interconnections with white-collar crime issues. In my book on white-collar crime, I talk about respectability, trust, and risk. Trust and risk as key dimensions of white-collar crime. Well, for the terrorists to be effective, they had to convey an image of respectability. They took advantage of, some would say, excessively high levels of public trust in the United States, which no longer exist. And some say that partly 9/11 occurred as a result of the allocation of risk by the airlines too much to the people getting on the planes. So all of those elements arise. In terms of state corporate crime, you had the role of states, famously Taliban, Afghanistan. You had corporations, banks that helped facilitate 9/11. And the World Trade Center and the Pentagon could be seen as major symbols in other parts of the world as the perceived state corporate crimes of the United States. So, I mean, they were picked as targets because they symbolized for these people, to a certain extent, what they see as the crimes. Granted, from the point of view of the suicide pilots, religious elements and other elements, but also a resentment of the role of the United States in that way. In the wake of 9/11, you, of course, had some fraudulent charitable appeals. You had businesses that exploited the tragedy. You had some fraudulent claims relating to losses. And immediately after 9/11, you have major corporations that were seeking bailouts and tax breaks. So, again, all of these elements of the after effects of 9/11 to some extent interconnect with aspects of white-collar crime. Now, in the post-9/11 era, then, we live in an environment of hyper-patriotism. There's been some reference here already to that. And in such a context, one has to ask whether the exposure of government or business wrongdoing becomes more sensitive, possible backlash, that you're attacking American corporations, you're attacking the American government when we're faced with this threat of international terrorists. The economic downturn leads to some shifting of priorities on recovery and jobs more than the crimes of corporations. And certainly the anger and fear relating to terrorism and future possible terrorism deflects at least some attention from white-collar crime. Certainly immediately after 9/11, policing and prosecutorial resources were deflected from attention to white-collar crime. I attended a workshop at the University of Pennsylvania not long after 9/11 and met the head of the FBI office there, and he said, yes, of course, I had to shift people off white-collar crime cases onto the terrorism issue. So it has had some effects in that regard. So to work towards wrapping this up, I'm arguing that understanding white-collar crime, globalized, postmodern, possibly post-9/11 world, criminologists need to engage with the literature of globalization, postmodernism, and perhaps the post-9/11 literature as well. We have to generate new frameworks, just existing frameworks, to accommodate this new context for understanding white-collar crime and its control. If we are to regulate white-collar crime in this globalized world, we're going to need new forms of transnational regulatory agencies. We're going to need much more democratic input or control over the international financial institutions. Some say we should abolish them. Others say we should reform them. We may need a permanent international white-collar crime court. We have, although without the blessing of the United States, there has been established a permanent international criminal court for war crimes. Perhaps we need, going forward, the same for international corporate, transnational crimes as well. We're going to need an enhancement of international law as it applies to corporations. And we're going to need enhanced connections between regulatory and policing agencies that are based in specific nations. So the concluding thought is that white-collar crimes control will certainly continue to have a local dimension. It will continue to have a state-based dimension, state of Kentucky, and it will have a national American dimension. But it also increasingly has to be understood as having a globalized dimension. It will certainly continue to have some traditional elements of fraud that go back thousands of years, that in some respects haven't changed. And it will certainly continue to have some modern dimensions, unsafe workplaces and factories, polluting the environment by industrialized factories. That will continue. But what I'm also suggesting is that it will have to continue to incorporate dimensions of an emerging postmodern society. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions.